and impassive, waiting for him to respond. I was pretty sure I knew what he was going to say. But maybe I was wrong. Surely he wasn't that much of an idiot.
"I will be in charge," he repeated.
Apparently he was that much of an idiot. Oh, joy. I cringed inwardly but kept my mouth shut, counting to 10 so that I wouldn't say anything stupid. I could walk away from the job, but the money was damned good and the connections were better. Any small business grows by word-of-mouth referrals. Took him off, and I could be going hungry for a long time. But it was tempting, because his stupidity could get me killed. On the other hand, Bob was here. He'd have my back, and I'd have his. Risking my life is part of what I get paid for. And, again, I was going to be getting an almost obscene amount of money for this. I glanced across the room to where the rest of the security room was standing. I mean, I couldn't actually be the only person worried about this, the only one to notice the prince's glassy, bloodshot eyes, could I? Surely somebody else was bothered by the situation. 2 of the guards stared past me as if I were beneath their notice. I felt my jaw clench, and had to force myself not to grind my teeth. I didn't know either of them, which surprised me. I'm fairly well connected in the industry. I've worked with most of the independents at one time or another, and most of them have come to respect my abilities and treat me as an equal. I'd have bet half of what I was making that they were pissed because I was a woman. I've dealt with the prejudice before. You'd think I'd be used to it. You'd be wrong. Bob's soft cough drew everyone's attention while I was shaking hands with the 3rd guard. He was clean, or at least human. We checked the perimeter. There was evidence it had been broken by a demonic presence. Miss Graves put together a temporary patch, but we need to contact the authorities. He said my name as if he'd never met me before tonight. I might have said something, but he gave me a quelling look. He was probably right. The prince didn't seem the type to appreciate socializing among the staff, and it wouldn't do to have the other guards pissed at him, too. The prince's eyes narrowed, and he gave me a long, assessing look.
"My people contacted the authorities while you were on your way up."
He turned to one of the nearest retainers, a short, square man with blunt features and small, dark eyes.
"Jean-Paul, take Joseph downstairs and deal with Miss Graves' patch."
The 2 men hustled off, not looking particularly happy. Then again, they didn't seem the sort to be happy about much of anything. Maybe they were paid to be surly, in which case Joseph deserved a bonus. Prince Reza stared at me, trying to judge my reaction. I tried to keep it neutral, but failed. His expression darkened.
"It's being dealt with. Satisfied?"
His tone was challenging. Not really. I'd be more satisfied when some of the militant religious were on scene. But saying that would just piss him off more. So would forcibly touching him. It might even create an international incident. We'd already started off on the wrong foot, so I kept my mouth shut and gave a curt nod.
"Good."
Chapter 2. The prince hadn't wanted to get entangled with the authorities, so we left before they arrived. I didn't like it. Since I was the one who'd discovered the breach, I was pretty sure they'd want to talk to me, not Jean-Paul. But it was made very clear that arguing would cost me the job, so I settled for leaving a business card with my cell number in case they wanted to call, along with an offer to give a statement the next day. So, with minimal delay, we had started the prince's night on the town. Now, at 3 a.m., my shift was half over. Thus far there had been no signs of assassins, demons, or really much of anything. Good. Even better, I'd managed to stay professional. That had been harder than I'd thought. The prince was impeccably bred, ridiculously wealthy scum. I hadn't quite been reduced to counting the minutes till I could be away from him, but I was coming close. We were settled in at our 4th strip club. I thought we'd reached the bottom of the barrel hours ago. I'd been overly optimistic. Apparently, things can always get worse. Even the dim lighting couldn't disguise that the place was filthy. The dancers had a desperation about them, the kind of fear you could almost smell in the air. Their bodies were scrawny, except for one or two who'd invested in the kind of plastic surgery that made Dolly Parton's figure seem positively understated. None of them could afford even the cheapest beauty charms to enhance their looks magically, so all they had to work with was their own assets, and most of them had been living hard for far too long. They looked rough. The theme of this place had something to do with pussycats. I was able to deduce this not only because of the sign out front, but also because the dancers wore cat ear headbands. The headbands were nearly their entire costumes, along with G-strings and jewelry. The G-strings were a formality so that liquor could be served. Pay enough for one of the private rooms, and they could disappear just like magic. Illegal as hell, of course, but I suppose that was the point. The prince was slumming, and he seemed to be working at finding the skankiest spots in the area. Doing a damned fine job of it, too. Honestly, were I him, I'd be worried about catching something antibiotic-resistant. Of course, he was too far gone to think of that sort of thing. He'd been imbibing various substances to excess since before I came on shift, and was blasted out of his frigging mind. Woe to his people if he wound up their king. I'd thought hiring me had been for publicity, but we hadn't gone anywhere he was likely to meet paparazzi, so maybe I actually had been hired on the strength of my reputation. Whatever. If the opportunity came up to work for him again, I'd be saying no. Bob was the only other guard who showed me any kind of respect. The other two just ignored me. I could live with that, so long as they did their jobs. Unfortunately, only one was. So 3 of us stood alert for danger, ignoring what was going on behind us. Bob was to my right. Beyond him was the biggest, blackest man I'd ever seen, with skin like polished ebony. He was built like a refrigerator, an oversized, industrial-style refrigerator. Huge and square as he was, you would have expected him to be slow. Instead, he could move with the sudden grace of a hunting cat. I'd seen it when one of the bouncers made a wrong move. Blinding speed and utter ruthlessness. I didn't know his name. We'd finished tonight's job, and I'd never see him again. Wouldn't break my heart, either. The 4th guard was practically useless. At the prince's demand, he was taking pictures with an expensive digital camera. He was young, and green enough that he'd acceded to the prince's wishes. Stupid. If anything went wrong, he'd be shit out of luck. The rest of us insisted on actually doing our job, at least as well as we could under the circumstances. An attorney once told me that my business contract had more restrictive clauses than some major motion picture deals. I told him I'd learned from past experience. If His Royal Highness died of a self-induced overdose, I wasn't liable. If he caught AIDS, herpes, or anything else, I wasn't liable. I protected him from violence. Period. End of story. My own morals would probably require me to haul his ass to the hospital if his stupidity made it necessary, but I didn't expect it to happen. He could function even after some pretty unique drug cocktails, so he must have years of self-abuse under his belt. I heard something behind the door to the main room. Almost in a single movement, the 3 of us turned to face the possible threat. Bob shifted his weight, his hand hovering near the butt of his weapon. The manager of the club stepped through the door with the bouncer at his heels. They came through at warp speed, slamming the door behind them with a level of controlled panic that made my neck hairs rise. The manager was a small man, but tough-looking. He had tiny, shrewd eyes and a sharp nose, but by far the most notable thing about him was his scars. A group of them ran from a mangled left ear down to and across his neck. It looked as if someone had tried to slit his throat with a beer bottle or claws. He slid home the bolts and turned to face us. He didn't look alarmed or afraid, more pissed. At his nod, the bouncer crossed the room to a second door and started to use keys on a number of locks. I assumed the door led outside. "The cops are out front." The manager sounded disgusted. "It's a raid. You've got to get out of here." A couple of the girls shrieked, and I saw the flash of naked flesh in my peripheral vision as they scurried out from the pile of bodies to start dragging on the nearest discarded undies.
I have diplomatic immunity.
The prince's words were slurred, but there was no mistaking his condescending tone. It occurred to me that the purpose of having a double had been to give the prince discretion. Discretion that would be ruined if he got caught, immunity or no. But maybe he was just too stoned or drunk to care. The manager was unimpressed. "Well, I don't, asshole, and I don't need the kind of media attention that will come with you being caught here," he snarled, "so get the fuck out." He pointed at the door. The bouncer opened it on cue. A dim beam of yellow light overhead revealed a narrow, filthy alley. A strong wind blew through the door, hard and cold. The stench it brought with it was horrific, even at this distance. His Highness shrugged and seemed bored, as though this was a frequent occurrence.
"Oh, very well."
I saw him pulling together his clothing with uncoordinated movements. His eyes were unfocused, but his speech wasn't too bad.
"You and you."
He waved in the general direction of Bob and me.
"Take the lead. We'll follow."
Someone had to take point. I would have done it, but Bob moved into place ahead of me. He brushed past the bouncer, deliberately giving the larger man a little shove on the way. The bouncer growled but didn't say anything. Probably a smart move, as Bob had pulled back and worked the slide on his 9 and was holding it with the kind of confidence that didn't bode well for anyone who posed a threat. I moved 2 steps behind Bob. I'd pulled my gun as well, a 1911 Colt. There are other 1911s, but they're clones. The Colt is the classic design that was military issue in World War I, and it's hard to improve on. Other people have argued with me about modifying the barrel, but I like it just the way it is. It's my favorite gun, and completely reliable. It fits my hand well and has plenty of stopping power. If I shoot something, I want it to stay down long enough for me to stake or behead it. With that in mind, I keep my gun loaded with silver-plated bullets. There were 3 steps leading down from the back door. To the immediate left was a dumpster. Up close, it stank badly enough to make me want to vomit. In the background, I could hear the manager's swearing and the prince's laconic response. The only light was from the doorway behind us, and the distant glow of a halogen streetlight past the alley entrance some 20 yards away. The odd lighting made the shadows deeper, so that every recessed doorway seemed sinister, every dumpster perfect cover. I kept my eyes moving, scanning not only ground level, but also the metal fire escape ladders and the tops of the flat-roofed buildings. The door we'd come out of was the 4th down in the row of buildings, giving us about 20 yards to traverse to the main street if we went right, almost 100 yards if we turned left. I stared down the alley, catching a glimpse of the front of the building reflected in the pawn shop window display across the street. I didn't see flashing lights reflected in the glass or any sign of a police cruiser. Before I could piece together what that might mean, a sound made me turn. A rat skittered. It was bigger than some of the more fashionable dogs and had been startled by something. I didn't fire, but it distracted me, costing me a valuable second of concentration. As I turned back, there was a wet, tearing sound, then a grunt of pain. A shot rang out as a warm rain splattered my face, and I smelled raw meat and fresh blood. Just that fast, Bob was down. I fired into the eye of his attacker that was visible above the throat where he was feeding. The entry wound was deceptively small, but blood, brain, and bone splattered against the wall behind him, sliding in runnels down the rough surface of the brick. The vampire dropped Bob, lunging for me with literally mindless rage. I fired 2 more shots directly into his chest until he went down for good, and I was sure there wouldn't be enough heart left to stake. "We've got bats!" I could barely hear my own voice shout the warning to the other guards as I turned on instinct to fire at a shape moving at me with blurring speed from beside a dumpster. The vampire shrieked but kept coming, swinging a clawed hand at my head. I ducked the blow and waited for that split second